All right, so I want to talk for a second real quick about how I make makeshift air pruning pots. This is not a method that I came up with, but I think it works pretty cool. A friend of mine showed me this. You get two similar sized pots, like so. You cut the bottom out of one. This slides in like that, okay? That's the first thing you got to do. Then the next thing you got to do, get yourself some hardware cloth, you know, a little bit larger than the diameter of the pot. It's good to cut it with these snips. Definitely recommend wearing gloves. This stuff will cut you really bad. The next step is, in my opinion, the hardest step. You're gonna fold this cloth up. Let me show you what I mean by that. The first thing you wanna do is fold in both sides about an inch or so. This doesn't have to look pretty or clean. You're just folding in both sides, this side and this side, like about an inch. Okay, next I folded the other two sides like this, so we now have a square, roughly. Again, this does not have to be super pretty. They don't have to all be exactly the same. You just want all four sides folded in on each other. All right, so next you just gotta fold in the corners, fold down or up the corners, however you wanna look at it. This is how it'll sit in its final position. It's okay that this is rocking back and forth and not totally flat. But yeah, so you fold up the corners, and then you just gotta jam it down into the pot. Now, if it doesn't want to fit, like this one doesn't quite want to fit, I made it a little bit too large. You can try to snip some off the edge with some snips, or you can come back and refold the sides so that it's all a little bit smaller. So I'm going to go and refold the sides just a little bit to make this easier to fit. If you're having trouble remolding the sides, folding any of it down, you can use something heavy like a sledge to tamp that side down. So it's a little bit smaller now, and it should fit very nicely inside of our pot. And it does, as you can see, pretty close to all of the edges. That's really good. And now, when we take this guy and slide it in, this is an air pruning pot, makeshift. It's pretty crude, but it certainly does the job. Now, it's not gonna hold as much soil as a larger air pruning bed, so this will need water more frequently. And, you know, it's not perfect, but I think these work really well. With some just scrap junk materials and a little bit of time, you can whip these up. And this should prune the roots very gently with air exposure at the bottom of the pot. You know, fill this up with soil, the root grows down into the bottom. And when the root goes through that hardware cloth, it's exposed to air. And just like in any air pruning system, that root slowly dies back, heals over very thoroughly, and you get horizontal branching roots. You don't get any root binding. And that taproot is still intact. You know, when you go and transplant the plant, that taproot can potentially continue growing the way that it wants to without having any issues that may be caused from if the plant was root bound. One thing to note is that a situation like this is not nearly as rodent proof. You know, I could imagine that mice could find a way to get into this pot from the bottom. So this won't be as protective of nuts or seeds that mice go after. It's still better, I think, or more protected than just a regular pot, but something to consider. I'm using these to grow out spice bush. One thing I really like about this is that it's cheap and quick. Compared to building a whole air prune bed, it's really efficient on labor and materials and time. And so, just energy in general. And so, you know, I can whip up a few of these. They're real small. So for something like spice bush, I don't have enough spice bush seed to fill a whole air pruning bed, right? A whole box. You know, I typically build my boxes at least 2 by 2, oftentimes bigger, like 2 by 3, 2 by 4. I have some 3 by 3s. So this is nice that in a very short amount of time, I can put together an air pruning system that I can put just a small amount of seed in. So I can still have some spice bush growing in an air pruning setup without having to invest time in building air pruning boxes or buying in a bunch of pots, specialty air pruning pots. Yeah, hand-built little air pruning pots. So yeah, you know, if you have a method that you like for building air pruning pots, definitely let me know in the comments. I'd like to explore more ways to do this cheaply, efficiently, and yeah. I really like the method of, you know, hugelkultur in a pot, where you bury some woody debris at the bottom of pots before you fill it up with soil. As with most of my growing trees, the main ingredient that I'm using in the soil mix is leaf compost. We're sitting on this big pile of leaf compost here, so I'm just gonna Fill this up with leaf compost. It's nice and wet because it just rained. Definitely, anytime you're dealing with potting soil, you want to make sure that it is, you know, a pretty optimum moisture content when you put it in to your container. Definitely helps a lot. The hugelkultur in a pot thing, by the way, if you're curious, and these are nice and aged wood chips. There's some fungi in here. I don't know if you can see. There's some glare from the early morning sun right now, but there's definitely visible mycelium on some of these wood chips. You want to use aged wood chips if possible. But yeah, I got this idea, you know, I didn't come up with it myself. It came from Sean over at Edible Acres. I think there's at least one, if not a few videos on this on their channel. If you want to learn more, check that out. So yeah, there she blows, all filled up with leaf compost. I know, not a very sophisticated soil mix. Sometimes I try to get more fancy and mix in perlite or vermiculite or other compost, but right now, this is what I have on hand, and this is what I'm using. For trees and perennials, I think a lot of them seem to do really, really well in just leaf compost, in my experience. Sometimes you get some that are not super happy. They maybe are wanting a little bit more of something else. I don't know how much I want to dive into potting soils in this. I think the bottom line is experiment with what you have, you know, use what you got and see what happens. I've had really good luck with leaf compost. It's easy. I have a lot of it around. I think in an ideal world, I'd maybe try mixing in some more stuff for aeration and maybe mixing in some worm compost as well for added microbes and nutrients. You know, the leaf compost is somewhat limited in the nutrients that it has. It's not quite fully done breaking down either. And it, you know, I didn't make this leaf compost. I got it from a municipal source. So it hasn't been managed you know, for microbes. It's, you know, this leaf compost came from a municipal source. I didn't make it. And so it has been managed with efficiency in mind, not with producing the highest quality, you know, most microbially rich compost. So there's certainly some good microbes in here, certainly some nutrients, but I think it would be good to inoculate, add in some really high quality worm compost, or, you know, if you have a really high quality just home, you know, thermophilic compost, or just any type of compost you have that's high quality, really finished, really aged, really good diversity of microbes. I think that's always good to add that when you're planting anything. But yeah, I don't know how much, like I said, I want to dive into potting mixes for this video. I'm using leaf compost because it's what I have, and I encourage other people to just experiment with what you got and see what works. You can see some spice bush seed here that I recently planted in these air pruning pots. We're going to do the same thing for this one now.